probably the most mysterious, strange, and incomprehensible island on Earth. Lost in the vast waters of the Pacific Ocean, it strikes the imagination with its monumental statues that have stood there for centuries, like eternal guardians of a mysterious past. When the first European travelers set foot on its shores, they discovered hundreds and hundreds of these stone giants. Some are as tall as a 7-story building and weigh almost 100 tons. That is Easter Island. We will consider 3 mysteries of this island which interest everyone. And at the end, we will reveal the main secret, which for some reason, almost no one talks about. Today, you're going to find out what is hiding under the layer of earth at the stone heads. Where did these giant multi-ton statues on the island come from? Who is behind their creation? And what is the real mystery of Easter Island, which is little talked about? The real mystery of Easter Island. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It will help us and YouTube's algorithms understand what topics you like more, and we'll do more content like this. Mystery 1. What is wrong with the island? And what happened to the people who live on it? A single look at Easter Island on a large scale is enough to raise this question. And as we think about it, we realize that it is not easy to find a clear and convincing answer. Judge for yourself. It's a triangular-shaped island. It is quite small, 24.6 kilometers, 15.3 miles long, and 12.3 kilometers, 7.6 miles at its widest point. That's a bit small for the birth of an entire civilization. But that's not the point. Look at where it is. It's an enormous distance from the mainland. It's 3,512 kilometers, 2,182 miles to the coast of Chile, the country to which the island belongs. That's a 4-hour flight in a modern passenger jet. What about the other side? It's the same. The nearest landmass, the Pitcairn Islands, is 1,931 kilometers, 1,200 miles away. There's nothing to say about the north and the south. It's just a vast ocean. Such distances were traveled with great difficulty by Europeans when they discovered America. And how did the first inhabitants of the island get to this island in the pre-Columbian times? And most importantly, why? What was so special about this tiny island that settlers rushed to it? What we see on it now is almost a desert. Such a huge discrepancy, of course, gave rise to many fantastic versions. What is the first thing that comes to mind if you imagine yourself for a minute a follower of so-called alternative history? Well, of course, Atlantis. It's gone underwater, and Easter Island is its remaining shard, and there are still people trapped in it. It all fits, except there's one little discrepancy. According to the legend, the mythical Atlantis was in the Atlantic Ocean. Easter Island is in the Pacific, but the Romantics have a quick and weighty, in their opinion, argument. They say the Pacific Ocean once had its own version of Atlantis, a sunken continent called Mu. Yeah, just like that. Mu, or Mu-land. However, such a strange name was given to it as early as in the 19th century. The French historian and ethnographer Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg and the American archaeologist Augustus Le Plongeon had a hand in it. But recall that human imagination has given each of the Earth's oceans its sunken continent. You know too, and add Lemuria in the Indian Ocean and Arctida Hyperborea in the Arctic Ocean. But those are fairy tales. But seriously, where did an island come from in the middle of the ocean? The same reason why a lot of other remote islands were formed, because of underwater volcanoes. But don't be disappointed, because it all depends on your point of view. Literally, and figuratively. Easter Island is the top of a whole huge volcanic highland. These craters on the island are impressive in their own right, especially if viewed from a bird's-eye view. But what's down there? If you remove the ocean, it turns out the island is the crater of a giant volcano with a height from the bottom of more than 3,000 meters, about 10,000 feet. That is approximately the height of the volcano Etna in Italy, or familiar to all, Fujiyama in Japan. Everything is very similar here, only the volcano is broader and more massive. You can compare it with Kilimanjaro. There, on the top, there is also enough to accommodate several settlements. Well, the origin of the island itself is not in doubt, and people did not stay on it after the flooding of the mythical continent, but somehow got there by themselves. The question is, how? And from where? To understand everything well, we should ask ourselves a question. When was the first time any Europeans sailed to this island and could return to report its existence? We do not know exactly when Europeans first reached Easter Island. It is very possible that in the 16th to 17th centuries, some seafarers came across this piece of land, but did not pay much attention to it or tell much about it. The recorded appearance of Europeans here took place on April 5th, 1722, when an expedition led by Dutch traveler Jacob Roggeveen saw this shore and approached it. They left for history the first evidence of the existence on the island of surprisingly friendly islanders and strange, huge statues. That's when the island got its name. Roggeveen had a habit of naming islands by dates and events that happened or were somehow connected to the time of discovery. So, since the island was discovered on Easter, he named it Easter Island, although the locals call it Rapa Nui. However, the visit was very brief and ended tragically for the navigators and many islanders. Yes, that first encounter was pretty bloody, but its details add to the mysteries of the Eastern Island civilization. Here's what happened there. The sailors were overjoyed when they saw the island, for they thought it was the continent they had been looking for so long. In ancient times in the Middle Ages, geographers guessed that somewhere south of the equator there must be an entire undiscovered continent waiting for its discoverers. In 1722, a small fleet of Admiral Jacob Roggeveen set out to find it. But getting to the island was not so easy. The ships cruised for 3 days along the northern coast, waiting out the strong surf that prevented them from landing on the shore. The boats were lowered only 5 days later, April 10th, and about 1,500 discoverers landed on the island. Here is how the first meeting with the locals was described by a participant of these events, Karl Friedrich Behrens, a sailor and soldier from Mecklenburg in present-day Germany, who served as a corporal on the ship Roggeveen. The natives swam off in the water in thousands. Some with small dinghies or skiffs brought us uncooked and baked hens together with many roots. While on the beach, they were running up and down like deer. It would seem that what could go wrong with such a friendly attitude from the locals? But here's what happens next from Behrens' words. By some misadventure, one of the natives who were on board the vessels got shot, and this must have caused a great consternation among them, for they all immediately sprang into the water, and some swam away towards the shore, but others made off in their skiffs with all possible haste. We then, with 150 men, soldiers as well as seamen, proceeded in the name of God ashore, and among them there was present our admiral himself, by whom I was given command of a section of the party. I was the first who, at the disembarkation, set foot on the island. The inhabitants pressed round us in such crowds that we could scarcely pass along, so that we had to force a way through them. And because some of them went so far as to lay hold of our arms, weapons, they were fired upon, by which they were direly alarmed and dispersed, but collected again in swarms. although keeping some 10 paces in front of us, believing that they were already out of range of our weapons at that distance. Many of them were shot at this juncture. The consternation of these people was by no means abated. Even their children's children in that place will in times to come be able to recount the story of it. They kept up an uncommon yelling. Women, as well as children, brought palm branches, red and white streamers, and various kinds of fruits, Indian figs, large nuts, sugarcane, roots, fowls, alive, boiled, and roast. They even flung themselves at our feet, displayed the streamers in front of us, and prostrated themselves on their knees before us, presenting their palm branches as peace offerings. They also made tender of their womankind, asking whether we would accompany them to their huts or had rather take them off to the ships. However, we did them no ill, but made a present to them of a piece of gaily colored linen print between 50 and 60 ells in length, which they measured fathom-wise more than 100 times over. We also distributed coral baubles, small mirrors, etc., by which they might be assured that we were their friends. These heartbreaking descriptions bring a lump to the throat and tears to the eyes. That's what first contact can be like, and we still dream of making contact with aliens. Further, Barons will more than once say how he was stunned by the friendliness of the natives, even though they, the invaders, killed several dozen locals in the course of this, so to speak, acquaintance. The landing was also a tragedy for Roggeveen's flotilla. One ship sank in rough waters. The expedition lost about half of its men, and the island itself turned out to be a disappointment because they were looking for a whole continent. More details about the island were told by the famous Captain Cook, who appeared here half a century later in 1774. Unfortunately, he was not there very long either. Otherwise, of course, we would have received much invaluable information. And further, the islanders were left to their own devices for a while. As we see, even the most powerful in the world at that time, European civilization, with its thirst for the discovery of new lands, was able to visit this island only twice in half a century, and that with huge problems. And again, we have to return to the following question. How did people get to Easter Island? Those very first people who created a whole original civilization. Many generations of archaeologists, historians, and anthropologists have puzzled over this question. The legendary Norwegian archaeologist and traveler Thor Heyerdahl did much work in this direction. His theory, which he adhered to all his life, was that the inhabitants of South America traveled westward on their rafts from the continent. To personally prove this by example, Heyerdahl made his astounding journey on a Kon-Tiki raft with 5 other heroes like himself. He wrote a fascinating book about it, The Kon-Tiki Voyage, in which he convincingly proved his theory. Then, Heyerdahl lived almost a year on Easter Island and wrote another no less marvelous book called Aku Aku. The book became a world bestseller. The author collected a lot of facts that seemed to him to substantiate his theory. These are the same plants that grow in America, the similarity of statues with statues of pre-Columbian American civilizations, and much more. But to the great regret of fans of this undoubtedly outstanding man, his theory was later literally trashed by other scientists. To date, most hold to the idea that it was exactly the opposite. People came to Easter Island from the west, and they were Polynesians. In favor of this version speaks many more facts, direct and indirect, and it is less contradictory. After all, it is reliably known that the Polynesians are great navigators. They even developed their navigation system from scratch, which they used for thousands of years to ensure long voyages of thousands of kilometers across the open Pacific Ocean. The Polynesians made contact with almost every island within the vast Polynesian Triangle, using outrigger or double-hulled canoes. Great distances were always a starting point for them, not a challenge. You only have to look at those scatterings of inhabited small islands in the Pacific to realize that. But there's another point here. Didn't you think something was missing in this story of the scientific search for an answer to where island humans came from? One technical detail. Here's a clue. Wouldn't it have been easier to ask the people of Easter Island where they came from? That is where a lot of people will have a pattern break. Those who have never personally studied the topic of Easter Island mostly know about it from pictures like this. That is, stone statues, and not a soul around. Involuntarily takes root the opinion that the island is uninhabited and only tourists and scientists visit it. But in fact, the island is quite inhabited, and we'll be back to this issue. Promise, you will witness amazing discoveries. So the inhabitants of Easter Island said that their great ancestor, Hotu Matua, came on several huge boats with his friends, family, animals, and seeds for future crops. He came from the west, from the island which the inhabitants of Easter Island called Hiva, and he sailed all the time towards the sunrise, that is, towards the east. Here, however, an exciting thing arises at once. In one of the versions of these stories and legends, it turns out that when Hotu Matua, with the whole crowd of attendants, sailed here on the island, his brother was already waiting for him. Yep, his brother. So it turns out that his brother had traveled here earlier, and Hotu Matua knew where he was going, not just decided to go into the unknown. We know that in the Marquesas Islands, there are several islands whose name includes the word Hiva. So this version fits nicely into the Western hypothesis of the origin of the natives of Easter Island. Well, on the first mystery, the scientists still have some kind of agreement, albeit shaky, but agreement. But what about the second? Mystery 2. Statues. Well, whoever the creators of these legendary statues were, and wherever they came from, we know next to nothing about them. Those people are long gone, but the statues remained, and there are many more questions with them than might at first appear. How did the natives make them? And how did they move these blocks? Why are there so many of them? Why were they made in the first place? And why are they so strange? Especially that last point. All these statues are really strange. There is something about them not quite earthly. Many people have had these thoughts, and many pseudoscientific theories have developed based on them. We will now clarify what can be clarified, and will not devalue what scientists have not been able to clarify yet. First, let's clarify the scale of the phenomenon. Let us remind you that if you were not specifically interested in the topic, you have most likely seen this group of statues and a couple of other beautiful angles where only stone heads stick out of the ground. In many ways, these heads have become an even more recognizable symbol of Easter Island than the full-size statues. And even a myth arose that this is how all the statues on the island look. And some sources presented the recent excavations that revealed the torsos of the statues as some sensation. Indeed, the footage from the excavation site may lead to such thoughts for many who have just begun to take an interest in the topic. But it's much more prosaic than that. The excavations have been going on for years. The work was led by renowned archaeologist Joanne van Tilburg, who is widely regarded as one of the world's leading experts on Easter Island statues. Working closely with the Easter Island community, the scientist compiled a list, description, and catalog of all the statues on the island. So, according to the researcher herself, the notion that the statues of Easter Island have only heads is because recognizable photographs most often capture only 150 sculptures, the same ones buried in the ground at the shoulders or neck. But nobody buried them on purpose. Standing on a rather steep slope, they have sunk underground naturally over hundreds of years. They were covered with soil during the rains year after year, century after century. Scientists do not doubt that. However, the phenomenon is not limited to these 150 heads. In fact, there are many more statues there, about 900. As of 2024, they are still occasionally discovered, so the number is getting close to 1,000. Only if they were small, but they certainly don't look like garden gnomes. These stone monoliths are in some cases giant. The largest is 21 meters, 69 feet high, and weighs about 150 tons. 21 meters is the level of the 7th floor of an apartment building, and the weight of 150 tons is 3 Boeing 737s loaded to the brim with passengers and luggage. Of course, not all Moai, as these statues are called in the local language, are such giants. Most are smaller. The average height is 4 meters, but still, the weight of even the smallest goes to tons, and the average is dozens of tons. Their making was very labor-intensive. Experienced artisans spent much time carving the statues with simple chisels made of obsidian volcanic glass. A team of 6 people worked on one statue for a whole year. Scientists managed to figure out these details from indirect evidence by performing complex calculations. Why do weight and size matter so much and raise so many questions? Because the Moai were placed around the island as if they were meant to protect it from invaders. And somehow they were moved to these places over great distances. How? How is this possible without modern cranes? The question is compounded by the fact that Moai were first made by working stone boulders. Only then the finished statues were transported in some unknown way to the installation site. That is well known because the place of production of Moai is not a secret. It was clear as soon as the island began to be explored. The vast majority of the Moai, 834 statues, or about 95%, were cut in the quarry of the Rano Raraku volcano here on the island. There were, and still are, giant deposits of tacolite tuff. This is a volcanic rock that, unlike basalt, is much looser and easier to handle. There are also basalt Moai, but they are in the minority for obvious reasons. The rock is too hard. One of the well-preserved Moai is now in the British Museum. So back to the transportation problem. For a long time, it was unclear. How is it possible to drag a giant stone statue several kilometers without a tractor and without damaging it? Here, the attentive viewer will ask a reasonable question. Wouldn't it have been simpler to drag the boulder workpiece to the installation site of the future statue first and only then start hewing it out? After all, you can drag the stones without fear of cracking the statue and wasting long, hard labor. That is a great question, and it was raised by researchers. But they did not find the answer. The natives of Easter Island were hardly clueless, so the scientists decided that it had some sacred meaning, and the question hung in the air. But the main question remained: how were these statues dragged across the island? There were many assumptions, sometimes absolutely fantastic. Well, really, the situation is almost fantastic. Some researchers believe that they were moved horizontally. They made wooden skids, put the statue on them, and dragged it further. It was also assumed that under the skids they made a wood planking, and it greatly facilitated the work. But there was also a version that the statues were moved in an upright position. It was indicated by many obvious signs. At least the fact that already in the quarry, some of them were raised vertically. Here again, we can think about whether to take the simple way and ask the locals how it really was. And this is almost the first thing that came to the mind of Thor Heyerdahl, who was very friendly with the islanders. Only the answer disappointed him a little bit. The locals said that the statues just walked by themselves. Yes, they just walked to where they needed to go. The answer could have been taken as a joke by some local funny man, but then it turned out that many islanders thought so seriously. And then Heyerdahl thought, maybe the locals are not so wrong. No, of course, he did not believe in the magic version. But he assumed that by wrapping one rope around the head of the statue and another around the base, the islanders could walk the Moai forward by swiveling and rocking it from side to side. These movements are roughly similar to the ones we use to move a refrigerator when we alternatively move each side a few centimeters. It is necessary to tilt it to one side and forward so that it rests on the floor only in one corner, to turn it horizontally in the required direction, to put it on one side, and to repeat so until the refrigerator goes where it should stand. Using this method, an experienced team could move the statue about 650 feet daily. Thor Heyerdahl and Czech engineer Pavel decided to pull the same trick with the Moai statue, or rather, with its concrete model. You've probably guessed by now that they succeeded. Later, many people conducted such experiments. All you need is 3 strong ropes and a couple dozen people, also strong, and the statue walks on. These experiments pretty much put an end to the how debate. But there are still questions of why, because let's not forget, those statues are very strange. For a long time, it was believed that the statues of Easter Island were eyeless. Indeed, they have specific empty eye sockets. At first, it was explained by some superstitions and prejudices. After all, eyes in many cultures are something special in the human body. And in our modern culture too, the eyes have a special meaning. Not without reason, they say that the eyes are the mirror of the soul. In some cultures, even children's dolls were made without eyes because it was believed that if you draw or add eyes to the doll, it could come to life and get a soul. Not much of a toy, to put it bluntly. So the idea was that the Moai were eyeless for some reason. This theory existed until archaeologists discovered strange, roundish-shaped pieces of coral near the statues during excavations. The Belgian archaeologist Henri Lavacheri was the first to notice them, but nothing indicated to him that they could have anything to do with eyes. Corals were often used to polish the carved stone surface and smooth statues. And the same Thor Heyerdahl guessed their purpose. In 1955, he was the first to make this assumption. And he was right. It turned out that the natives made the statue's eyes of white coral, and black pupils served as pieces of obsidian. By the way, on modern photos of statues with eyes, it's not that it's completely new, but still a restoration. The eyes that fell out of some statues were put back in by hand. Large stone hats on the heads of some statues raise separate questions. They are called pukao in the local language. It feels as if they are specially painted in a reddish color. In fact, they were originally made of a different material, light red volcanic slag, which was mined in a single place in the southwestern part of the island. Why were these caps needed? No one knows for sure. There are only versions. What is known for sure is that the pukao did not appear at the same time as the statues themselves. They were put on their heads in the 15th to 16th centuries, tens or even hundreds of years after the statues were made. And characteristically, not all of them, but only some. And there is a rather convincing version which fits well with what the statues symbolize generally. Finally, we have reached, if not the main question, then at least one of the most interesting. Who or what do these statues represent? And why did the ancient islanders produce them in such quantities? Have you noticed that the statues are different in size and in physique and facial features? One of the most convincing versions says that they are not just faceless stone statues, but are somehow connected with the ancestors of the Rapa Nui people. And that sounds fascinating, with quite specific ancestors. Probably, each Moai statue is a stone incarnation of a dead ancestor. It could be a very specific ancestor with a name, a family, some life of his own, and of course, his characteristic appearance. It is astonishing, but who knows? Perhaps on Easter Island, we see about 1,000 monuments of once-lived real people. They made statues of their ancestors and worshipped them for exactly the same reason that many other cultures did. And this point intersects with the question of, why is it necessary to put red pukao hats on some statues? Apparently, some ancestors somehow distinguished themselves in a specific way after their death, already being a stone statue. After all, remember, pukao were put on the statues many years after the statues were made. Perhaps those ancestors listened to the prayers and granted a fruitful year or some other blessings for which they were honored with such symbolic gratitude. But the ancestors were not always favorable. And one day, something happened on the island that, for such a closed ecosystem, can be considered the real end of the world without exaggeration. And it has eerie parallels with our entire planet and humanity. Mystery 3. Where did everything disappear to? You probably haven't noticed another oddity in our story. It's really unnoticeable. Remember when we talked about the transportation versions of the statues? There was a version with wooden skids and a wooden deck. Well, look at this. Do you see any wood here? Indeed, if you look at the island from a bird's eye view, you can see that there are not many trees on it, to put it bluntly. Not that there are no trees at all, but most have been planted already nowadays. And in the past, the island was indeed like a golf course. So why do researchers believe that statues were moved on wooden skids and decks? After all, given the number of statues and the rapid deterioration of wood, the wood consumption would have to be on an industrial scale. Or maybe there were forests on Easter Island once. But where did they go in that case? Stay to the end and find out this real mystery of Easter Island. Scientists directly or indirectly link these questions to another Easter Island oddity not often discussed. The question is not only how and why people made and moved these huge statues. The question is also why they stopped doing it. With the help of radiocarbon dating, experts could find out that statues started appearing on the island around 1250 AD, and then the process suddenly stopped around 1500 or so. The creators of the statues simply left their stone chisels where they had last used them, and only a quarter of all the statues were installed where they were planned. Half were left in the quarry, while others were abandoned halfway through. The process stopped so suddenly that there's still no clear explanation. It looks like a plug was pulled out of the socket, a remote control was flicked on, and everything was turned off. Those are the associations that come to mind. And of course, it throws wood into the fire of fans of alternative history that includes aliens with their paleo contact. Admittedly, this is a case where a truly rational explanation is hard to find, and there is still no consensus as to why it happened so dramatically. But there is a very plausible version, which we will summarize at the end of the video. As for not versions, but just the facts themselves, the following picture emerges. When the first expedition of Europeans led by Jacob Roggeveen arrived at Easter Island in 1722, the natives only worshipped the statues, but did not make them. They hadn't made them for 200 years. And when the famous James Cook sailed here half a century later in 1774, he was met with a grim picture. This once prosperous island was in disrepair. Most of the fields were abandoned, and those that were still under cultivation yielded a meager harvest. The locals were in poverty, and most of the statues lay on the ground. In just 50 years, even those remnants of the amazing, very strange, and mysterious civilization that Roggeveen had found had become a handful of hungry, miserable people. Even their stone gods lay down defeated. There is a theory as to why the Moai statues were thrown from their pedestals. Probably the inhabitants continuously suffered new misfortunes, crop failures, disappearance of arable land, wars, and feuds. All this, sooner or later, led them to bitter disappointment in their deified ancestors, who could not or would not help them. In anger, despair, and bitter resentment, the Rapa Nui pushed the statues down and even gouged out their coral obsidian eyes. The saddest part is that it didn't help them anymore. The next generations of islanders faced new hardships. What happened to people next? It didn't get any easier in the 19th century. The slave trade was still thriving, and greedy traders had made their way to this remote island. The local population was subjected to literally devastating raids from the continent. In 1862, the island was attacked by Peruvian slave traders who captured and drove 900 people to mine guano in the Atacama Desert, including the last Ariki king. Guano is the naturally decomposed remains of seabird droppings. In those times, it served as a valuable nitrogen-phosphorus fertilizer and raw material for manufacturing gunpowder and TNT. Slave labor kept the cost of extraction to a minimum. Sometime later, another 300 inhabitants were captured and taken to the island of Tahiti to work on plantations. Not only the natives of Easter Island, but even the missionaries who lived there fled from the subsequent invasion of inhuman profiteers. They all fled in despair to the Gambier archipelago stretching west of the island. The loss of population was devastating. In the short period of time between 1862 and 1877, the number of inhabitants of the island fell from 2,500 to 111. As we said at the beginning of the video, Easter Island is by no means uninhabited these days. According to the 2017 census, about 7,700 people live on it. And surprisingly, about half of them are descendants of those very same Rapa Nui people. Yes, that's right. Although you can't call it a happy ending, the Rapa Nui people have not disappeared without a trace, but continue to live. These people live ordinary, modern lives like other peoples of South America. And that's a good thing rather than a bad thing. After all, their ancestors survived a localized but very real end of the world. And that, you know, is no joke. But what happened to the trees after all? Epilogue: The real mystery of Easter Island. The famous traveler Jean-Francois Lapérouse, who reached the island in 1786, saw the devastation and decay and came up with some theories about what happened there. He speculated about it in his notes and mentioned trees which the inhabitants had the imprudence to cut down in very ancient times. According to Lapérouse, the sloppiness and mismanagement of the population was the cause of the island's decline. And there is every reason to believe that Lapérouse was right in his ruthless but accurate assessment of the short-sighted and irresponsibility of the ancient inhabitants of Easter Island. Modern archaeologists have found a lot of evidence that the Rapa Nui really destroyed their own habitat with their hands. In the heyday of the civilization, Easter Island was covered with a dense forest of trees and palm trees. But generation after generation, the indigenous people gradually destroyed it. It can be partly explained by survival motives. The forests were cut down for arable land. The wood was used as building material for dwellings and boats, or for transporting statues at best. But why at best? Was there a worst case? Yes, it was. Apparently, the islanders simply burned a huge amount of wood. Archaeologists have found a layer of ash and charcoal in the ground almost all over the island. This can't be explained by any kind of campfire for domestic purposes. It looks more like either some kind of sacrifice that is not quite clear or just a simple utilization. The islanders did not realize that by destroying the forest for arable land, that they were upsetting the ecological balance. Sooner or later, without a barrier like the forest, the rains would wash the fertile soil into the ocean. That's exactly what happened. The Rapa Nui cut down the forest for the fields, leaving them with no forest and fields. And therein lies the reason why the Rapa Nui stopped making statues. It could be a combination of factors. Over time, it became too resource intensive, besides years of feuds that became more and more heated as they fought over dwindling resources, and the emergence of new cults. Desperate natives seemed to hope that the new gods would be better than the old ones. Be that as it may, the roots of the decline of the Easter Island civilization are inexorably rooted in ecology. There are different versions of the exact moment when the islanders passed the point of no return on the way to the ecological catastrophe that crushed civilization. Precise data is essential for science, but something else is crucial to our understanding. Easter Island is often compared to a separate planet. It's very remote and isolated from the rest of the world, and the parallels between all of us and our planet are very telling. And what matters to us is the legacy of this lost civilization, its true mystery. That mystery lies in the question, what was the Easter Islander thinking when he cut down the last tree?